I am Falling Hurts, Duke of YouTube. I am the Lisan al-Gaib, and as Major Glazer Stilgar might say, it's as it was written. And let me tell you, the only good thing I'm writing today is how goddamn good Inkulinati is. There are many games I can walk away from with very minimal complaints or even criticisms. I'll be honest, turn-based games aren't really my favorite genre, but between the Thaumaturge recently and this, I have changed my ways. Especially when presented with such a unique charm and humor, with beautiful visuals and even era-appropriate musical sense. Inkulinati recently had a 1.0 release, and it's now on all major platforms. Coming from Yaza Games, Inkulinati has you taking on the role of the game's title. You'll command drawn forces of characters that you'll utilize ink to create on pages of medieval manuscripts. Now, whether you've already played the game in its early access state on PC or you're catching up with one of the other console releases that have happened over the last couple months, I have to say that this is an exceptionally strong game. At $24.99 US, I can't help but say that there's a lot of fun to be had with this game, especially if you look at a trailer. You're going to know basically right away if you enjoy the concept here. But the basic gameplay loop is this. There are two types of matches that you have, or two levels per se that you may have. One of which are beast fights, basically meaning you have a limited number of your army going into a level. You cannot replenish them at any point. You can use their abilities to heal, things like that. And the enemy will be the same way. You just have to basically war of attrition, beat all of the enemy's forces before you lose all of your own. Those are the simplest matches, and generally the faster of the two sorts. The other, however, is where you control your tiny, and sometimes the enemy has one as well. Your tiny is basically your embodiment, basically your king, if you're playing chess. You protect them at all costs. They have their own HP, and much like something like Hearthstone, where once you've cleared a lane of enemies, you can kind of attack the enemy player's actual main health bar. That's kind of what's going on here as well. But in both of these game modes, they follow a lot of the same rules. Like I said, it's really just a time difference of, do you have another enemy tiny, drawing new troops in between rounds, as in between rounds, and based off of kills and certain other small statistics, modifier gameplay, things like that, you get more ink in between certain rounds. Meaning that, depending on the cost of ink to create, say, an archer as opposed to just a swordsman, you may not build any new troops in between rounds, or you may build 3 in any given round. But whether it be melee, projectile, or even support and healing based units, there's always so much variety in what you're actually uncovering. I should note that this game is, in some degree, at least in its presented campaign or what there is to play, a roguelike game. As you go through each of these 3 versions of the story, or however you want to say it, you'll be presented with choices in which combat encounters you want to do, whether it be tiny versus tiny, or tiny versus just beasts, where you only have to kill the beast, there's not any more spawning in. And then eventually you'll get your choices of certain reward paths as well, increasing your total health, or your starting ink levels per match, and things like that. You're also rewarded with different abilities for your tiny. For instance, nudging along little characters and moving them one spot over left or right, or healing them, attacking enemies directly with your tiny. It's all very interesting with how you can kind of create your perfect mix. But with that being said, one of the rewards you get are actually new troop units. And as I said earlier, whether it be melee, ranged, or support characters, you're going to notice that there's little intricacies between very similar types. For instance, there's multiple archers, some of which can attack multiple people at once, and some of them can attack singularly. There's also different swordsmen that you can use as well, with different abilities, and different traits as well, different amounts of health, things like that. But then you've also got the spearmen who can attack even in the levels above them, or even 2 spaces away rather than just right next to you. Intricacies like that are what make this game really, really strong. That makeup of your army as you go into these levels is super important, and knowing what you need for the right job is great. Another thing to consider, and this is just a small little thing I thought was really interesting, if there are any priest-styled characters within the map, if someone attacks them, they become a heretic, and they get a bunch of debuffs. Or if you consider one of your characters showing their ass to the enemy, and if the enemy's facing them, they also get kind of a headache, or they get sick. Debuffs like that are so interesting, and really comical, honestly. And I think that kind of fits in with the kind of slapstick humor of, I don't know how to say it, medieval times. I can't say I've ever been there personally, but if you've ever seen Game of Thrones, whenever you see some lowborn people or like peasants around, they kind of have the worst sense of humor, and this kind of strikes as just that. Now, of course, throughout this video, I'm going to have plenty of gameplay showing, but one thing I want to talk about pretty much right away is the variety. There is so much to think about and so much to learn. There is a tutorial for the game, but I don't feel like it tells you anything that just hopping right into that main gameplay loop doesn't already teach you. I feel like I did waste a little bit of time playing the tutorial, so I don't really recommend it, especially if you're just playing the game on normal difficulties, which is balanced very, very well. I feel like there was a good challenge at normal difficulty. Though one thing I will say with that is there is a mechanic that I feel like was underused at normal difficulties. There's something called a boredom level or a boredom stat. If you draw too many of the same type of character, within rounds or, repeatedly, basically your Inkulinati character becomes bored of them. It becomes bored of drawing them, so they're less effective. So ultimately, you kind of benefit from switching up your playstyles here and there. But one thing I'll say, the effects weren't that bad. But on another front, I feel like this wasn't really necessary. I feel like based off of seeing what kind of units you can expect per your next match, you're going to organically be kind of switching things up as it is. So I feel like maybe with a little bit more mystery as to what you could have expected, that may have required a bit more of changing things up. That being said though, as you're going through these roguelike elements, one thing I really like about it is you have a certain number of pens, or your lives basically. So you have a few attempts and you can gain a few more throughout the gameplay, which I really like that a lot. Another thing I really like, which is kind of a minimalistic presentation, but I think it is really, really strong, is actually the writing in between the levels. There's a lot of comedy in this game, and not just in the visual style and the gag humor. There's also a lot of really funny and just kind of witty and cute writing in between and with the little dialogue choices that you have. Definitely adds a lot of charm to the game in that sense as well, and I was never bored in between playing the game when I was reading either, so that's huge. From a story standpoint, there's nothing crazy. It's not something that's going to blow your socks off. There's no some grand story, and if there were a negative I really walked away with, it would be that. In some of the trailers for the game, you actually get a live action full motion video of some characters playing the game just in video form, which I thought was really cool. Honestly, if I had to say anything, and I don't know if this would be more expensive or less expensive than animations themselves, but I would love to see a full motion video story kind of played out in between certain, checkpoints of this gameplay loop that made it more like, let's say it was one guy going across the country playing these different characters on these manuscript pages. I thought that would be really cool, but maybe that's just me. Outside of the story and, the very, very strong and varied gameplay loops, you've also got the visual presentation, which I can't lie is super, super strong. Everything is displayed immaculately, whether it be the fire that's slowly pushing your units closer and closer together as the game draws on, or the variety of different creature types that you're experiencing, whether it be skeleton, bees, humanoid hares, foxes, or even dogs, different creatures all around fit into that same aesthetic style that feels like it's straight out of, something you uncovered with Indiana Jones as your sidekick. And to top it all off, I think it all falls within this really nice and subdued color palette. There are strong colors for sure. They stand out on the page, but I really like the tones that they use. It's really light at first, and then it kind of, works its way up. And in doing so, it almost feels like, these sketches are slowly but surely coming to life as the game goes on and the story progressively gets more and more complete. That being said, in your tiny fights specifically, where you have one player health bar versus another player health bar basically, what I really like is these main fights, these boss fights, are always complemented by one of the coolest features I've ever seen in the game. So obviously your characters and these levels don't take place upon the whole screen itself. So at the top of the screen, as these levels progress and things go on, you're actually going to notice that writing is kind of outlining the journey and the combat of what's taking place in the lower parts of the combat. This is only truly able to be done if you consider the fact that each unit you place gets a randomly designed or randomly generated name. So for instance, let's say Bobby Boy, my archer, gets placed down, and then in the next round I use him and he attacks and takes out, say, a donkey. So up at the top of the screen it'll say, the archer Bobby Boy, flagrantly took out the blah 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 donkey ass guy. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But the way the screen fills out and, as everything kind of comes to a head towards the end of the match, it is so, so cool. And honestly, the best word I can use for it is epic. And the visual presentation for this game is quite strong. Bouncing right off with that, the audio design of this game is pretty good. I will say there are some minor gripes I had personally, but I feel like it's something that's, it's not that big of a deal. So let me just say, this is a podcast game through and through. I played all of my time on this game completely undistracted by anything. I wanted to hear the music, I wanted to hear the sound effects, and with that being said, the music for this game, as I said earlier in the very beginning, very era appropriate, it feels strong. You've got instrumental stuff that sounds perfectly designed for the time, and nothing feels out of place. As for the type of music, it's very upbeat, lifty, something that you would want to have combat to, I guess. That being said, I think the sound effects of the game are great and terrible at the same time. Great in the sense that they're all punchy, weighty, and they all convey everything perfectly, whether it be the water, the fire, the elemental effects, and, each of the individual weapon types as well. Where it gets annoying for me, I guess not bad in quality, but annoying, is actually the animal sound effects and like the Yeah, I hate them all. Something about it, I just didn't like that. Something about that style, I would have just rather them stay silent. But, it's fine. It is what it is. Ultimately, this game falls within a really nice niche of both historical in presentation while also being a turn-based game, and it all kind of gels together in such a way that it feels really strong. And so with that, I'm really glad that the game works really, really well in the Steam Deck. I, of course, assume that means it works well on the Switch as well. I didn't play there, but I'm not really worried about performance, even on that lowest common denominator system. But I really, really like Inkulinati. There's a lot to love about it. There are minor gripes that I have, but overall they take away nothing from the experience, the amount of playtime I actually got out of it, and the amount of fun I had just kind of working through levels. The challenge is definitely there, but what's really more gotten to me is the presentation. It's a strong visual style, decent audio, and overall just a great myriad of different ways and playstyles that you can kind of go about accomplishing your goals. For $24.99 US, I fully recommend Inkulinati. I think it's a great game. I'm really excited to see what the developer does next. This kind of seems like a bit of the end for that early access period for their game, so I'm curious to see if they take it a step further with a sequel or add even more into this game, maybe as an expansion, or hopefully something new entirely with a new challenging art style. I think they can definitely pull it off. That being said, thank you so much for watching this video. Consider subscribing, and yeah, goodbye.